Okay, we're going to now hear from Simone XX from Canada. Simone XX is a writer for Women Are Human, currently specializing in political opinion editorials. She's based in Canada and is focused on strategizing to mitigate the impact of federal legislation and upcoming laws on women's sex-based rights. Simone is also a member and provincial coordinator for Women's Declaration International Canada. And you're going to be talking on why feminists should be deeply concerned about Canada's Bill C-11. So thanks very much, and over to you.
There are two things that you should know about me. As mentioned, I am Canadian. And two, I have chosen to remain anonymous in my gender-critical work. Before joining the cause of gender-critical feminism, I researched both sides equally and weighed my options carefully. My decision to support women's sex-based rights was determined by rationale. In the words of the great feminist Maya Angelou, I am a feminist. I've been female for a long time now. It'd be stupid not to be on my own side. I also believe that feminism was created by females for females. And so too then is the legislation passed in support of women, thanks to the work of feminists. But we are facing an era that attempts to persuade us that feminism isn't feminism if it doesn't include biological males. This is an abuse of the tenets of diversity and inclusion. It is manipulative, and it speaks to the psychological warfare that gender ideologues have been waging against us. Perversely, disrupting this logic carries a social stigma that has the capacity to damage a woman's career, relationships, and her health. Knowing all too well what males are capable of, I concluded that I could do my best work anonymously, both as a writer for Women Are Human and as a member of Women's Declaration International Canada. My decision to remain anonymous is also informed by my knowledge of the looming legislation in Canada's Parliament. And that brings me to the point of why I'm here today. Freedom of expression is our most important fundamental freedom in Canada. Without it, we are unable to fight for any of our other rights or freedoms. Free speech and freedom of the press are essential to the health of democracy. And so we must be able to exercise them efficiently through a diverse range of perspectives, including the feminist one. Under the authority of Liberal Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, the Honourable Pablo Rodriguez, Minister of Canadian Heritage, introduced Bill C-11 in February of 2022. Bill C-11, commonly referred to as the Online Streaming Act, amends the long-standing Broadcasting Act to extend its regulatory powers to include the Internet in Canada. The Broadcasting Act is overseen by the Canadian Radio and Telecommunications Commission, better known as the CRTC. Bill C-11 has been publicly criticized by free speech advocates for being flawed in various ways and even ominous towards freedom of expression. But given my audience, I will focus on the aspects that as a feminist I find deeply concerning. Bill C-11 is a terribly dull and innocuous sounding piece of legislation that barely registers on the radar of most feminists and gender critics. However, cloaked in subtlety, it hides the tools to suppress gender-critical feminism while promoting an ideology that quietly embeds female erasure into the psyche of Canadians. Bill C-11 doesn't discriminate against women, per se, but fails to even acknowledge our existence at all. Female erasure has been stealthily traversing the globe at a formidable strength and speed. We are literally being written out of law. And that should be alarming to every single female-born woman on this planet. On June 21st, 2022, Bill C-11 was passed by the House of Commons into the Senate. To quote from within the summary of the bill, this enactment amends the Broadcasting Act to update the broadcasting policy for Canada set out in Section 3 of the Act by providing that the Canadian broadcasting system should serve the needs and interests of all Canadians, including Canadians from racialized communities and Canadians of diverse ethnocultural backgrounds, socioeconomic statuses, abilities and disabilities, sexual orientations, gender identities and expressions, ages, and provide opportunities to Indigenous persons, programming that is accessible without barriers to persons with disabilities, and foster the full recognition and use of both English and French in Canadian society. So, there are two elements to pay attention to here. Firstly, while implementing provisions for marginalized groups, women were left out. It is my contention that all sexes ought to be added to this clause. As we know, there has been a global effort to replace the word sex with gender in language and the law. And as feminists, we have seen the detrimental effects that this trend has had on women's sex-based rights. Now, you might argue that women are included in the phrase all Canadians. However, it is only implied that women are included. We must insist on explicit mention in law, therefore leaving no legal gray area. Furthermore, if all Canadians truly means all Canadians, then why even bother to emphasize inclusion of all ages, for example? In fact, why emphasize any of the other characteristics? I will return to that question later. Sometimes what's missing is more telling than what's there. So I compared the current version of the Broadcasting Act to the proposed amendments of Bill C-11. This revealed a gender sanitization. All references to women, men, and children have been removed and replaced by the phrase people of all ages. Ironically, the only mention of gender is in the explicit mention of provisions for Canadians of diverse gender identities and expressions. This is the second element to pay attention to here. It's because certain groups, such as those defined by gender identity and expression, which are explicitly included in the list, will be given priority in funding and grants. They are also among the groups who will be consulted to provide recommendations to the government on broadcasting policies based on their best interests. This is mentioned deep within the convoluted content of this 44-page bill and is confirmed in an important document that my research led to. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's mandate letter to the Minister of Canadian Heritage, written to the Honourable Pablo Rodriguez and dated December 16, 2021, stated that we must continue to address the profound systemic inequities and disparities that remain present in the core fabric of our society, including our core institutions. To this effect, it is essential that Canadians in every region of the country see themselves reflected in our government's priorities and our work. As Minister, I expect you to include and collaborate with various communities and actively seek out and incorporate in your work the diverse views of Canadians. This includes women, Indigenous peoples, Black and racialized Canadians, newcomers, faith-based communities, persons with disabilities, LGBTQ2 Canadians, and in both official languages. So you'll note the explicit mention of the word women in the Prime Minister's mandate letter. All of the other groups from within this letter were included in Bill C-11 in the same or similar terms. So why were women the only group from this mandate omitted in Bill C-11's stated intent to raise the voices of marginalized groups in Canada? Women have been historically marginalized for millennia and continue to be so to this day. The feminist agenda for equality between the sexes is not complete, and we should not have to still fight to further articulate the need to recognize this. According to Statistics Canada's latest reports, violent crimes of a sexual nature against women and girls have been on the rise in Canada. And according to a report published by the Canadian Femicide Observatory for Justice and Accountability, 160 females were violently murdered in Canada in 2021 alone. Men committed over 90% of these murders. The Femicide Observatory has stated that one woman or girl is murdered in Canada every 36 hours. I would also like to note that 2 of Canada's largest mass murders were both mass femicides. There were those committed by pig farmer Robert Picton, convicted in 2002 of only 26 out of a possible 65 murders. The grim details of which shed a light on the horrible injustices to Indigenous Canadian women. And there was the Montreal Massacre of 1989, when 14 female engineering students were murdered in cold blood after the shooter ordered the male students to leave the classroom. During this massacre at École Polytechnique, there was an exchange between the murderer and his victims in which he said that he's a man who's against feminists, against women like them, right before he opened fire. There had been a surge in the recognition and rights of women that preceded the Montreal Massacre, just as there has been in the recent past with the Me Too movement. Backlash is one of the pitfalls of social progress. So I worry about a rise of violence against women, especially given the vicious dehumanization by those who call feminists TERFs. When Senator Sheila Feinstein spoke while representing the Canadian delegation at the 4th United Nations World Conference on Women, held in Beijing on November 6, 1995, she recognized that this might happen. She said that differing perspectives over the rightful place of women in society will divide us, that a backlash against equality will hinder our ability to move forward or to hold on to past gains. This must not happen. We must not fail. Men's rights movements have been growing across the globe. Our progress is being overturned, no doubt as collective punishment, a sentence to put us in our places. Just look at what has recently happened in the United States with the overturning of Roe v. Wade on abortion rights and its impact on the female population. We must be able to speak openly and legally about issues that exclusively affect the female sex. Yet sex is being omitted and nullified in Canadian law, despite being one of the protected characteristics in the Canadian Constitution Act. The exclusion of women and sex from Bill C-11 is particularly important because this bill is about communication in Canada. And communication is essential to the feminist movement, whether within nations or internationally. This bill is currently at the second reading in the Senate and is being studied by the Standing Committee on Transportation and Communications. Now, some of you will be familiar with the case in the UK where women's rights activist Marion Miller was charged under the Telecommunications Act for gender-critical tweets. Eventually, the charges were dropped, but not without significant disruption to her life. I worry that we will see similar vexatious litigation, or worse, brought against Canadian feminists if Bill C-11 is passed by the Senate. In my article, Gender-Critical Feminism May Soon Be Criminalized in Canada, published in 2021 by Women Are Human, I spoke about how these fears were founded. This bill first caught my attention in 2021 when it was introduced during the previous parliamentary session, then called Bill C-10, also known as the Broadcasting Act. This act is not a standalone piece. It is a significant aspect of a larger puzzle, one of female erasure and censorship. And if it is put into place, it will enable a far more threatening bill, the Online Harms Act. As gender-critical feminists, we must strategize like chess masters, anticipating the next several moves of our opponents. We must analyze their patterns and learn to predict them. If Bill C-11 reaches royal assent, the Internet in Canada will come under government regulation, rendering online content, including user content, subject to all Canadian laws, including the restrictions under freedom of expression. The Liberal Party of Canada has promised to reintroduce the hate speech bill, known as the Online Harms Act. This will add gender identity and expressions to the list of characteristics protected under freedom of expression. While the old version of this bill has already been introduced in the current parliamentary session by an independent member of Parliament as Bill C-261, a similar bill is waiting in the sidelines to be introduced by the much more powerful Liberal Party. Here, we find ourselves living in an era where it is not those who commit moral harms who are held accountable, but rather those who call them out. A victim reversal. This could mean that publications such as Women Are Human, or webinars such as WDI's Feminist Question Time, are penalized not only for expressing opinions, but for revealing truths. Canadian trans rights activists and lobbyists have encouraged their community to silence any dissent from their ideology and to sue at every opportunity. Gender critics have repeatedly been shut down. We are told no debate. And that is precisely what these activists will continue to say when consulted with by the CRTC when it comes to policy creation. No debate and no reference to biological sex. So regardless of how clever, articulate, or respectful we may be in our arguments, we face fierce opposition in Canada. The gender identity movement is supported here by everyone from our corner grocery stores to local city halls to every major financial institution. Yet there is no support for women who protest male bodies in our safe public spaces. There is no support for our freedom of expression, which is based on our sex. We are silenced at every turn. Abuse thrives in silence. Canada is one of the member states who has repeatedly made promises to the international human rights community, to the United Nations, and to the women and girls of Canada to uphold the obligations set out in the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, or CEDAW. CEDAW defines discrimination against women as any distinction, exclusion, or restriction made on the basis of sex which has the effect or purpose of impairing or nullifying the recognition, enjoyment, or exercise by women, irrespective of their marital status, on a basis of equality of men and women, of human rights and fundamental freedoms in the political, economic, social, cultural, civil, or any other field. But in direct contrast to the promises made by the Government of Canada, Bill C-11 does just that. It discriminates against women by exclusion made on the basis of sex from human rights and fundamental freedoms. Furthermore, Canada co-sponsored Resolution 68/181 at the United Nations General Assembly on December 18, 2013, which states that it is deeply concerned that historical and structural inequalities in power relations and discrimination against women, as well as various forms of extremism, have direct implications for the status and treatment of women, and that the rights of some women, human rights defenders, are violated or abused, and their work stigmatized, owing to discriminatory practices and those social norms or patterns that serve to condone violence against women or perpetuate practices involving such violence. Framed as an initiative to promote Canadian talent, the Broadcasting Act will have far-reaching effects not only on what Canadians say, but also what we see. the intricate web of policies defined in Bill C-11, once applied, will enable the CRTC to regulate internet platforms in Canada, requiring them to implement algorithms that elevate certain content while deprioritizing other. Discoverability on the Canadian internet will be subject to the appropriateness of content as dictated by the CRTC, determined in consultation with the communities described in Section 3 of the Broadcasting Act, which I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation. This applies to both domestic and foreign content. Content providers who earn a profit through streaming in Canada will be subject to taxes that will support the Canadian Media Fund, or CMF. Programs that meet the stringent requirements of CanCon, short for Canadian content, will be eligible for funding from the CMF. Essentially, what is framed as a bill to promote Canadian content is going to allow the government the mechanisms to decide which Canadian content is worthy of public funding and viewing. This is where Bill C-11 moves from being a feminist issue to being a gender-critical feminist issue, if one so chooses to acknowledge the difference. Because Canadians of diverse gender identities and expressions are explicitly named in the objectives of this Act, they are amongst the groups eligible to receive considerable support from the Canadian Media Fund. Conversely, as women are not explicitly mentioned, we are not amongst the designated recipients of support according to these objectives. In fact, the regulations are such that we are likely to have to pay to have our content made discoverable on the Canadian internet. Let me clarify. Women may be monetarily taxed and/or penalized, whereas those who assume women gender identities will be granted funds to further disseminate their ideology. The long-term harms to women's sex-based rights in Canada may be catastrophic. And our youth growing up on the internet today and future generations may never know a different reality exists. If a gender-based analysis had been performed on Bill C-11, surely the factors that I have identified would have been discovered and amended, as per Canada's commitment to the women of Canada, to the United Nations, and to the international community. Communication is essential to participation in a democratic nation. So when women were left out of the conversation, it harms our ability to participate in public life. Why didn't the Committee for the Status of Women and Gender Equality and Youth insist that we have a seat at this table? And what are we to make of Trudeau's Liberal Party, who calls themselves a feminist government? Freedom of expression is our most valuable human right as gender-critical feminists. Without freedom of expression, we are unable to fight for any other rights. Without freedom of expression, we are unable to fight for sex-segregated spaces or sex-segregated sports. Without it, we are unable to speak out against the medicalization, sterilization, and mutilation of our youth. And without it, we are unable to challenge existing legislation that increases the vulnerability of women and children and harms our human dignity. And without freedom of expression, we will be unable to protest against any future legislation that threatens our autonomy as women and as a female sex-based class. This is not just a challenge, but also an excellent opportunity to introduce Women's Declaration International Canada to our federal lawmakers. Bill C-11 is written in such a way that we can critique it based solely on the exclusion of women's sex-based rights, without having to fight against another marginalized group of people. That would be a benefit to our reputation. My hope is that we can establish WDI Canada as a respected women's advocacy group that the government refers to when seeking public consultations on matters concerning women's rights in Canada. In closing, I would like to urge Canadian women to move beyond merely recognizing and calling out the shortcomings of our government. As feminists, we must communicate directly with our government through engagement in public consultations, writing letters to our members of parliament, to our senators, and to the committees involved in legislation and policy creation. We must unlearn our tendency towards learned helplessness and not wait for leadership to guide us. Instead, we must recognize the need to adapt to new challenges, even if that requires learning new skills. We must discover the potential of how we can contribute both as individuals and together in maintaining our collective status as a sex-based class. As feminists, we must analyze, we must strategize, we must organize, and we must mobilize now. Because if women are left out of the most important bills that shape our communications for the foreseeable future, we will surely be erased from that future.